Hi, today I'd like to talk to you about playing with and against an isolated pawn. A lot of people tend to be a little bit polarised in their views on this. Some people will absolutely adamantly never ever play with an isolated pawn. They see it as an absolute weakness which will lose the game. Whereas some people absolutely love playing with it. They love all the open lines around it and they can't possibly imagine having to play against one. I tend to believe, though, that if you play well against an isolated pawn, you tend to play well with one, and vice versa. If you play well with one, you tend to be able to play well against one also. I think you need to be able to play it on its merits. Of course, the general rules, when you've got the isolated pawn, you keep pieces on the board, you don't swap anything off. And when you play against the isolated pawn, you simply try to swap everything off, get into an endgame, and the closer you get to an endgame, the weaker the pawn gets. One thing that is common to both sides of the position, though, is that you control the square in front of the pawn. Let's have a look at some situations where we put our pieces. So I'm going to I'll take all the pieces off the board and just keep the pawns here. I could have perhaps prepared this earlier like they do in the cooking shows. Here's one I prepared earlier, complete with an isolated pawn. So we'll start off with the white isolated pawn. So typical isolated pawn position. You can get this type of structure from a Queen's Gambit, all the sorts of Queen's Gambit openings, Queen's Gambit declined Slav, Queen's Gambit accepted. You can get them from a Panov attack in a Caro-Kann, and you can also get them from a C3 Sicilian. So it sort of doesn't matter whether you're an E4 player or a D4 player, or what you really play as black. There's quite a lot of situations where you can get this sort of position. Typical isolated pawn on D4. Now, black has the two pawn islands, one here, and white has pawn island here, and the isolated pawn by itself. So, of course, we all know that isolated pawns are weak because we don't have a pawn to protect them. So the pawn is here, it just simply plays this and nothing will ever attack this. Whereas in this situation, there's no backup. So the pawn's on its own, needs major pieces to defend it. So let's start off with black. How are we going to play when our opponent has an isolated pawn? Now, of course, the most important square to control is this one, the square in front of the pawn. If you can establish a knight there, it's the absolute perfect outpost. Nothing will dislodge this knight. Even another knight or a bishop, say you get a knight here or perhaps a bishop here, whatever. You take the knight and then the king occupies the square. Now what we're talking here is deep into the endgame. But in the middle game, you simply just back it up with a rook. Or back it up with a bishop, for example. Or even another knight here. So it's very important to control the square in front of the pawn. But what you don't want is a situation like this, where you have to isolate your own pawn. Now your pawn structure advantage is totally nothing. It's dead equal pawn structure. So very important, control the square in front of the pawn. Back it up with a bishop, like this. Your other knight, and this all depends on what position you've played, what this has come from, what sort of opening, you know. This knight may have developed itself like this, in which case it can come in here. But, you know, it could be kicked away. Another day it might have been developed that way, and then here. It all depends. Your dark squared bishop. Now, obviously, if it came from a Nimzo Indian, this dark squared bishop would be off the board, but sensible spot for it is here. If you're lucky enough, you may have an option where you can develop it this way, or bishop here, f6, and then like this. Whether or not that's necessary all depends on the exact position. Your heavy pieces, simply control the line in front of the pawn and control the open line. Whether you do this by piling all three up or whether you just have one of them there and pile the other two up like this, it's all up to you, depends on the exact position. But essentially try to swap everything off, weaken the pawn, get into something like this, and you're absolutely cooking with gas. This pawn's going to be very hard to hold. So that's the black strategy, or the player against the isolated pawn. If you're playing with the isolated pawn, it's a little bit more cutthroat in that you have to keep pieces on the board. If you don't, your pawn's just going to become a lot weaker. But there is another strategy too, and that's to swap the pawn off in favourable conditions. So most important is control the square in front of the pawn. I can't stress this enough. You need to control this square when you have an isolated pawn. You need to control it with everything you possibly can. So knight here is very important. The reason you need to control this is because at the right time you can potentially push this pawn. And if you can push this, swap it for this, you can wreak havoc in your opponent's position. What you'll generally want though is active pieces. So your other knight tends to be on this square. Bishop usually here. Of course, if you can establish a weakness in black's position, then your isolated pawn is not going to be such a big deal. So for example, a swap like that may weaken the black king side. You know, that you're starting to find you've got advantages in your structure too. Of course, black's very rarely going to allow that. Bishop tends to be good here, but again it can work here too, ready to push that pawn. It all depends on the black position. Rooks are important, rooks and queen. And two schools of thought. One is to control the two open lines, and probably a better one though is to have the rooks on these squares. Again, one behind the pawn, ready to push that pawn. Queen tends to develop itself to e2, and you notice that most of these pieces are aiming at this e6 square. There's countless situations where you can sacrifice on this square. Takes here with a check and picking up a bishop, so regardless if the king moves here, or even if they block it with something, you can still just take this bishop. So queen to e2. Generally with the rook behind the pawn, you've got more option of pushing it. Again, this push may work here with an exposed piece. Knight will often move itself to this square. Can be quite useful. If you have to swap a piece, so for example, something like this swap's not so bad. You then get hanging pawns, and I tend to find with hanging pawns, it's kind of useful having bishops like this, really just push them, and you may even get a situation here where you've got an isolated pawn which is also a passed pawn. So it can be good or bad. Tends to be quite good, but this is another situation, another day's lecture. We're really just discussing isolated pawns as such. So develop your pieces actively, gain as much activity as you can, and essentially don't swap. Keep the pieces on the board. At the right time, dissipate the weakness, or gain enough strength in other areas of the board and you should be doing okay. As for black, swap everything off at all costs and gang up on the pawn, weaken it and get yourself to the end game. I hope this has been helpful.